Welcome to CIHT Podcasts.
Welcome to CIHT's podcast. I'm Shalini Kumar, CIHT's Policy Advisor on Transport Infrastructure. Today's podcast will explore how we shift our perspectives on transportation to become more sustainable. We will start by discussing the highway junction design and then move on to a larger scale of policy. Joining us today is John Parkin, Professor of Transport Engineering at the University of the West of England and Deputy Director of the Centre for Transport and Society. So welcome, John. Thank you for joining CIHT today. Please tell us a bit more about yourself and your background.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me, Shalini. So, my background is in consultancy with Michel and then Atkins. And then in 1998, I joined academia. So I've covered all the fields of highway and traffic engineering and transport planning, dealing with policy, modelling, forecasting, operational analysis, safety, economic appraisal, design, construction, and latterly now I do a lot of work in relation to evaluation, particularly the evaluation of sustainable transport investment.
That's great, really interesting stuff, and you've got quite an extensive background there. So we're going to look more closely into how the changes in the highway code might impact sustainable transport modes.
Sure. Okay. So, the highway code, that's an interesting thing to start with. So very recently, there were some changes to the highway code that came in January of this year. And those were created really because the Department for Transport decided that the current code wasn't quite working properly, and they certainly want to not only improve safety but improve the nature of streets for all users. And I think we can be forgiven. It goes all the way back to sort of total and parp and people in cars, where we begin to think that might is right. The larger the vehicle, the more right they have to use the road, which is certainly not what regulation suggests. So what the new highway code has done is very much bring into a sharper focus what they're calling a hierarchy of users, and pedestrians are now very much at the top of that hierarchy, followed by cyclists and then motorcyclists, car drivers, van drivers, and then heavy goods vehicle drivers. So the point there is that it's all about broadly speaking, the mass of the vehicle and the speed of the vehicle. And the higher the mass and the higher the potential speed, the more damage they can cause, and therefore the more those users have to watch out for the users at the top of the hierarchy. Now, I think that's uncontroversial. However, there's been an awful lot in the media, certain parts of the media, about those changes, and that comes again from the view that if you're behind the wheel of a car, then you're the one with the right of way. Whereas, of course, everybody has a right of way, and we have to regulate that right of way, and we have to have a code to allow us all to use the roads, safely and appropriately. So that's one of the most principal changes to the highway code, but I think there are a couple more there as well. The first, and this I know is going to lead us on to a deeper discussion about junction design. The second change is around give way, priority junctions. And the suggestion is that in the future, drivers and riders, so I'll make the point that it's cyclists as well as drivers on the carriageway who are turning into the side road, will need to give way to pedestrians, not only crossing the road already, but also waiting to cross the road. Now, you could be forgiven for thinking, because of all the media attention to this, that this is a completely new rule. Well, it isn't quite. It's just an extension of the existing rule. And the existing rule was that drivers should give way to pedestrians who are already crossing. So a very minor extension, I would argue minor, some would argue incredibly major and disruptive and all the rest of it, is the fact that car drivers now have to give way, and riders, cycle riders, have to give way to people waiting to cross as well. So what does that do, and why is the change being made? Well, what it does is certainly assist in that hierarchy. It's beginning to say that these people, pedestrians particularly in this case, do have rights of way, and historically they have been, if they had a lot of side roads to cross along the road, having to wait very frequently to cross that side road. So we're beginning to try to shift the balance there a little bit. And I think that's good, because it will theoretically, he says theoretically, hopefully in practice as well, encourage more people then to walk on the basis that hopefully in the future they'll be able to cross side roads more easily and more safely. So that's the second very major change. And there's a third change as well, which is that drivers, so if you're driving along the road and you're going to turn left into a side road, let's say, or right into a side road, should not cut across cyclists or horse riders or horse-drawn vehicles or any other vehicle that is lower down the hierarchy, particularly cyclists, really, we're talking about here, who are going straight on. And you might again say, well, I mean, that's common sense, is it not? You know, you're driving up to a side road and there's a cyclist ahead of you, you're potentially going to just about overtake it to the side road, and you do, and you turn in front of them. Well, that's not good behaviour, full stop. But that's the behaviour that we have seen, not infrequently. And that third change around not cutting across cyclists is a very important change again there. So I would argue that these changes are very important, marginal in some ways, subtle, but really assist in helping to adjust in urban areas, because we're really talking about urban areas where we've got a good mix of different types of user, changing the balance between different types of user.
I really love the idea of the shift, obviously prioritising cyclists and pedestrians, but also that shift in responsibility. So really making all users responsible for their actions. And, you know, you've got HGVs, you've got the cars, the vehicles. So just becoming a bit more responsible, those mass vehicles, what they are doing, and like that safety aspect you mentioned.
I'm glad you said that. I'll just come back to that, I think. One thing that we wrote for the Institution of Civil Engineers, actually rather than CIHT, but we wrote a response to the consultation. We pointed out that in fact, I talked about cars at one level and then heavy goods vehicles at a different level. But there are many, I'm not going to call them cars, they are SUVs, sports utility vehicles, which are 2.5 tons. They're incredibly powerful vehicles. And I'm beginning to think that we ought to have some special designation for those types of vehicle as well. I mean, they need to take much more responsibility than somebody in a very small, light vehicle, you know, that's maybe not capable of very high speed. So it's a good point.
Yeah. I wanted to go on to talk about a study which you've looked at, which was the continuous side road crossings. I was hoping if you could give a bit of a background on it and just explain exactly what the study was looking at.
Sure. Yes. So this was a study funded by Transport Scotland via Sustrans in Scotland, and we looked at continuous footways, and I'll explain what those are in a minute. We are also now undertaking another study for the Road Safety Trust, where we're looking at marked priority side road crossings. So I'll just describe the difference between those two and the fact that, you know, in a sense, why we're doing two studies on them. So the continuous footways are footways where you would have literally the footway continuing at the level of the footway across a side road, and motor vehicle traffic that's turning into or out of the side road then effectively crossing what looks like and feels like and is, to all intents and purposes physically, the footway. So it's inverting the logic where the pedestrian is entering the carriageway to cross and changing it to the fact that the motor vehicle and or cyclists turning in or turning out are in fact then leaving the carriageway and crossing the footway to continue onto the next bit of carriageway, either on the main road or the side road. So those are continuous footways, and they are created, broadly speaking, in design terms, so they're made to look and feel like the footway. The other type that we're studying still in the Road Safety Trust project are marked priority crossings, and those are where the give way marking will have been displaced such that the give way is in a position where the motor traffic will have to give way to the pedestrians crossing on the footway, or there may in fact be a zebra. And where there is a cycle track crossing as well, it will be clear that the cycle track has priority over the side road. So now understanding what a continuous footway is and what a marked priority crossing is, I'll go into a bit more detail about what we did in the continuous footway study. We did broadly 4 things. The first thing was to undertake some observational studies of interactions between pedestrians and vehicles at these types of junction. We also looked at the collision record, and we interviewed people in focus groups, particularly people with different abilities, people with visual impairments, and so on and so forth. And finally, we interviewed a series of specialists in the area, key informants, many of whom were CIHT members, so we thank them for that. So, interestingly, what did we find then? Well, of 4,500 interactions that we observed, and this is the subtle point, we're looking at this from the point of view of the pedestrian, but so often in traffic engineering, if I can call it that, we look at everything from the point of view of the motor traffic. So, from the point of view of the pedestrian, we found that in 90% of cases, there was no yield. So in other words, the pedestrian was, I nearly said marching then, but that has a sort of evaluative connotation. But the pedestrian was walking across the continuous footway, and the vehicle that was turning in or turning out was giving way to them. That contrasts with similar junctions where there is no continuous footway, broadly around 60%. So the point is there is much greater ability therefore for pedestrians to cross the continuous footway unobstructed, as it were, by the movement of vehicles. The really interesting bit is the 10% though, of course, and we're saying, okay, what happens with the 10%? Was there a collision? Well, we'd spotted no collisions, but that of course is the worst fear, as it were. And of that remaining 10%, broadly 1% were what we defined as voluntary yields. In other words, the pedestrian was interacting, but then sort of waved the vehicle through. So they were saying, okay, you know, we know that we've met, but it's okay. In the position you're in and the position I'm in, please you go. So there was no real risk in that situation. But it's the remaining 9% which we classified as forced yields. In other words, the pedestrian was forced to yield as a result of the behaviour of the driver. And what we need to do, therefore, is make sure our continuous footways are designed in such a way to minimise that potential for forcing the yield, and therefore for near misses and potential collisions. What did the focus group participants say? Well, what we know already, really, we need distinctive paving materials. We need to slow down vehicles by raising the level of the footway. I've already said that. We need to avoid gradients and obstructions on the footway itself. It needs to be clear. Tactile paving is a hot subject within the community, and intriguingly, as it were, despite the fact that many in the group were from the visually impaired community, the use of tactile paving was thought to be counterintuitive in the situation where we're effectively saying that the pedestrian is the person with the right of way, because it's sending the countervailing message that actually no, you need to be careful here because there's a carriageway crossing. I think the jury's still out on that, but I was very heartened by that approach. With the key informant interviews then, those professionals emphasised some of the more detailed factors that maybe the regular users were less aware of. It's the design detail that we have to get right. So the continuity of the curb line along the main road, absolutely critical. No visible radii on either side of the side road. In other words, the radii are gone, so there's no clue that this is the line that can be taken in terms of a turn. Continuity of the main line road markings, if there are yellow no parking lines, for example, and vertical upstands to slow the traffic down. So those were some of the design features that we came up with. And we're going to be combining the results from the continuous footway study with the results, and we're analysing them now, from the marked priority study, in order then to understand which type of approach might be most appropriate in different sorts of circumstances.
I think those are really interesting results, and obviously you mentioned that the engineering side of things have been primarily focused on the motor vehicle as opposed to the user and the pedestrians and cyclists. And I mean, the point you made there with the tactile paving being counterintuitive, I thought that's really interesting that was picked up, because I often think as a pedestrian when I'm crossing the road that it's actually my fault that I'm crossing the road, and obviously you see the driver and they'll look at the pedestrian and say, oh, you're to fault, and you'd never think that the driver is to fault. But how do you start shifting that? Is that purely through design, or is there another intervention that needs to be put into place there?
Mm-hmm. Well, a very quick look into the future then, it looks as though from our marked priority study that the continuous footways are more successful than marked priority. I don't want to say too much because we've not fully analysed the results yet. So your point there is absolutely valid, that in principle it's about getting the design right, because then the design influences the behaviour. And there's a sort of three-way relationship between, we've already mentioned it, the highway code and regulation, design and behaviour. And they all have to be properly aligned, and arguably, historically, they've not been as aligned as they ought to be, particularly with the requirement in the highway code to give way to a pedestrian crossing a side road. And that's not, to be honest, that common. And then coupled with that, the fact that that's probably because the design has not been indicating, not been pointing in the same direction as the code has been pointing in, to help reinforce what the behaviour ought to be in a street which is wonderfully sustainable and appropriate for all types of user.
I think obviously the lessons that you're going to learn from these studies will be really important, and as you say, it will feed into the three-way bit there with the design, the behaviour and the highway code. I'm aware that obviously you're doing some e-learning modules for CIHT on sustainable transport. Obviously these sort of things and the design features will really encourage more sustainable transport, and obviously priority to pedestrians and cyclists and so forth. Do you want to tell us a bit about the e-learning courses and how that will encourage more sustainable transport?
Sure, yes. There are two that I've been involved with, and thank you for CIHT for asking me to be involved. One is, broadly speaking, an introductory course to sustainable transport. So it's looking at the general background to the whole issue of sustainable transport, and that's from the point of view of planning, policy, legislative context, engagement with the stakeholders, and so on and so forth. But in addition then, there is more comprehensive, larger, longer. It comprises of 4 separate components rather than one component, which is looking particularly at planning for cycling. So note that the course is around planning for cycling rather than specifically designing for cycling. So it's about getting all the ducks in a row, as it were, in terms of understanding the benefits of cycling. Again, the legal and regulatory context and the principles for provision. It's then looking at strategies, local and national, to promote. It looks also then at how we go about network planning. And I cannot emphasize this enough. Historically, when we've looked at cycling, we've often regarded it as a safety problem at specific locations on the network, which we've tried to solve often not very well. But broadly speaking, every transport mode requires a network. You know, we have a network of buses, we have a network of roads, we have a network of railways and so on and so on, a network of airlines and so on and so forth. The network is key. But for cycling, it is very inappropriate to offer routes to cycle on for all everyday cycling purposes, which are on higher speed roads with higher volumes. We absolutely know that most people will not be interested, because it's not attractive and not comfortable, to cycle on roads like that. And therefore we need to plan comprehensively networks for cycling. Sometimes they will be coincident with the highway network, sometimes within the carriageway, sometimes adjacent to the carriageway, and sometimes away from the carriageway. So network planning occurs in the third component. Then the final component deals with issues around behaviour change, theories of behaviour change, the development of behaviour change programs, and then also monitoring and evaluation of sustainable transport schemes. So, of course, I'm biased, but I will thoroughly recommend any and all of those courses to anybody who would like to take them.
Well, they sound like very exciting courses, at least for myself. I mean, I'll probably be signing up to them. And I feel what you've said so far really kind of leads on to that larger scale of policy. And as you say, there is the other 2 aspects, which is the design and behaviour. But also it's really about looking at how we can flip the view of road investment in transport. And really, as you say, with that network planning, well, we need to change perspectives or shift the perspective. So how do you see us flipping the view for road investment?
Yeah, I mean, that's the multi-million ton carbon question. I nearly said multi-million pound question then, but let's convert it into the unit that we're really concerned about, carbon. So yeah, I mean, fundamentally we do need good, strong policy, and it is interesting to look at how policy is developing, not only in the English Department for Transport, but also the devolved nations. And it's interesting then to compare and contrast. And I think what I would like to do is just think a little bit about the Welsh situation, which is a very interesting situation. They now have, published in March 2021, the Wales Transport Strategy. They have a net zero Wales carbon budget and future Wales around planning policy. And that is strong policy, but the interesting difference is they are now applying that policy very strongly. So there is a hierarchy of users again. We've already met a hierarchy in the Highway Code. Net Zero Wales, for example, talks about 30% of the population working either at home or near to home. So it's looking at potentially sort of work hubs near to home. It's talking about reducing car miles travelled per person by 10%. And it's looking at not increasing the overall capacity of the road network for the private car. Now, those are strong policies, but they're only strong if they are applied. So the interesting thing is to look at how they are being applied. And the Welsh Government has in fact set up the Roads Review Panel, which is looking at issues around what is currently in the pipeline and how roads in the future should be considered and thought about. Things such as, for example, the central case for demand management within road provision, for speed management particularly, related more appropriate to safety than carbon, but there was also a carbon benefit from lower speeds. And also how you treat sustainable transport as a core element of your road building strategy rather than necessarily seen as a sort of an additional bolt on. And I'm sure every government, local government still has a long way to go with thinking these through. But I think, we need to make bigger, bolder, stronger strides, and it's in many ways very fortunate that we have now 4 devolved nations, and they're all doing slightly different things. So it's quite interesting to now be able to compare and contrast and see how things will pan out.
Yeah, I think obviously there's a lot to learn from, say, the Welsh Government, as well as there's a lot to learn even globally from best practices and various examples. I don't know whether there are some examples that you could think of other than Wales that maybe we can kind of look at perhaps from a behavioural change aspect, because I think we are getting there with the change in the highway code, but it's really the design aspect and the behavioural side that I think just needs a bit more of a push. But obviously, as you say, there's a lot going on in Wales. But I don't know if there's anything else that's a bit more.
Okay, so the behavioural question is really important, really big question. You're absolutely right. So I think my analysis would be that historically, over the last 10 or 20 years, what we've broadly been doing, all of us everywhere in the whole world, has been, in a sense, tinkering at the edges, perhaps. So when we see demand beginning, we begin to build something. I think that's the case in London. We began to see quite an upturn in cycle use in the early noughties. And arguably, my colleagues in Transport for London may disagree, but arguably we were playing slightly catch up with that, to satisfy that demand. But then I think Transport for London has gone well beyond that now and is now boldly investing very large sums to assist in creating much more comprehensive networks that are well designed and will be attractive and are comfortable. And that, alongside the regulation, is what will change behaviour. And I think sort of exhortations at the margins to, for example, offer people mini incentives and showers at work and breakfasts if you cycle in once a year and things like that. I think we need to move beyond some of those fairly low level, fairly crude behaviour changes, because it is the nature of our environment that will determine how we travel in the future. So if we build roads for cars, we'll get more cars. If we build cycle routes for cycle traffic, we'll get more cycling. If we build boulevards for people to walk along and promenades for people to walk along, we will get more people walking. And if we build comprehensive networks of bus routes, we'll get more people using buses. So if we build it, they will come, famously, as the saying goes.
I mean, it's a really interesting point you make, because in CIHT's Better Planning, Better Transport, Better Places document, there's the quote in there which looks at predict and provide. Obviously, that's kind of what we've fallen victim of in that aspect. And like you say, it's really about if we build, then it will happen. And I think that's a great way to kind of step forward. And I'm really enjoying this whole cycle that you've kind of put in my head here with the planning policy and legislation and the design and behaviour, and looking at it as a cycle, that it all kind of feeds into each other. And I've really enjoyed this conversation. I hope that everyone else takes as much of what I have from this conversation, and looking at how we can better invest in certain like network plannings and going forward to just think about transport more sustainably in light of the climate crisis we're in. So with that, I just really want to thank you, John, for speaking with us today, and also telling us a bit more about your research as well as your thoughts on the ways moving forward for the future and the bigger picture of it all.
Great. Well, thank you for inviting me.